Now, this week marked the grim 12-month anniversary of the October 7 terror attack by Hamas on Israel. It shone a light on our disgracefully, in my view, weak state and federal governments who limply allowed anti-Israel protesters to march through the streets of Melbourne and Sydney, spouting their anti-Israel chants, flying Palestinian flags. It's been going on all year, but it was particularly poor when it took place on Monday. Now, Sky News contributor Gemma Tognini, I think she really summed up the mood of Australia in a very powerful piece in The Australian last week. She joins me now. Gemma, that piece was really from the heart, wasn't it?
Everything I've written about this issue since last year, Steve, has been absolutely from the heart. That one in particular, I think most Australians, I genuinely believe most Australians share my disbelief that, as you said, our government, state and federal, have been so flaccid in their response to the ugliness and the evil that has been on our streets, and particularly those marches taking place on the 6th and the 7th of October. Disgraceful. Australians don't want that, of that I'm sure.
I took a call from former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, who's obviously, he's done a fantastic documentary that was run here on Sky. He's been very brave in speaking out strongly. But when I took that call from him in the lead up to Monday, he sounded like a broken man. I know he's not because he's so strong, but it's just you can tell in someone's voice that this has just got too much.
Look, I think it's the relentless nature of it as well. I mean, I'm not Jewish and I'm not Israeli, but I do know the difference between right and wrong, and I do have, without tooting my own horn, Steve, I learned a bit at school and I learned a bit at university, and none of this is about land, or none of this is about a two-state solution. This is about eradicating Israel from the map, because that's what Iran wants and that's what its proxies want. And you don't even have to imagine that. That is their stated aim. And to pretend otherwise is just so desperately dishonest, and we need to call these things out. And in relation to my column last weekend, talking about, which children we advocate for and which children we don't. And let's be clear, every single death of a civilian man, woman or child is a tragedy, but wars are terrible. Best not you start them. And to sort of put some context around my thinking around that, in the Syrian conflict, Iran and Syria have been responsible, according to the UN and according to the Syrian Human Rights Network, the deaths of 31,000 children, Steve, 31,000 children killed by Iranian forces and Syrian forces. ISIS have been directly responsible for the death of 958 children, some of which have been tortured. That's documented. Let's look at the Sudan, for example. This year in the Sudan, there has been a 500% increase in the rape, the abduction, the murder, and the recruitment into child militia forces of children in the Sudan. That's this year. 4 million children are displaced in the Sudan. 700,000 of them are subject to the worst episode of malnutrition in modern history. Where is the coverage of this? Where are the marches advocating for these children? They're not happening because there are no Jews involved. This is what anti-Semitism looks like when it talks about global policy and media coverage, and that was the point of my column. Every death of every child is a tragedy, particularly in the context of this war that Hamas started as a proxy of Iran on the 7th of October last year. You talk about ceasefires. Hamas broke a ceasefire on the 7th of October and refuses to negotiate one going forward. There is no grey in this area. There is no, obfuscating. It is right and it is wrong, and our government respectfully has been found so wanting.
Yeah, we've had no leadership whatsoever. I mean, I want to go to back to the streets. Now, we've witnessed these marches through the major capital cities just about every weekend. Well, every weekend since the 7th. What are we teaching in our universities? And we had universities occupied for week after week after week. We had, I think, one building at a university in Sydney that was actually renamed after a Hamas terrorist.
Yep.
I mean, what is going on in our institutions that a cohort of 18 to 22-year-olds are not prepared to read the history like you have, but are just seem to be fed this anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli stuff, and they just walk out there without questioning it.
I think there's a few things at play there, and one of them is obviously weakness in leadership from universities. I mean, we saw the Senate estimates inquiry, the Senate inquiry, and Mark Scott's response to that saying that the university leadership had failed Jewish students. I mean, well, tell us something that we already knew. We already knew that 6 months ago. So there's a weakness that emboldens this kind of behaviour. That's the first thing. Second of all, over the years, curriculum has gradually been eroded from, you know, history to what do you feel about history to what's your take on history to being completely revisionist. I mean, people say, you know, let's go back to pre-1948. All right, let's ask the Egyptians and the Jordanians if they want to take control of the disputed territories. I mean, that's how ignorant people are. And you've also got... it's funny you should ask me this question, Steve, because I've actually looked at that in my column for tomorrow's Australian, a little bit particularly about women and what it is about young girls. We see young girls marching in the streets, you know, simping for terrorist organisations that would never countenance them the freedoms that they're allowed to live under in Australia. I mean, there's no marriage equality under Sharia law, Steve. So I think it's ignorance. I think it's a combination of weak leadership and an education system that progressively over the last decades has lurched to the left, seemingly while nobody's been watching.
Last week's column was outstanding. I can't wait to read tomorrow's. A good reason to get out and buy the Weekend Australian. Gemma, always great to catch up with you. Thank you very much.